A little bit about me. My background actually is in computer science. By day, I actually do DevOps work for a startup company out in California. Basically maintain build systems, automation, a whole bunch of, as I jokingly say, everything that's not inside the box of the product, making sure it runs. Food science and cooking is kind of a passion for me as a side hobby that's kind of overtaken my life. I never expected to end up in Germany speaking to a bunch of Germans at a .NET conference. But it is a pleasure and an honor, so thank you for having me here. And with that, let's jump in a little bit. So when the idea of this talk came up, it was with the idea of trying to draw some analogies between the computer world and the food world. And as I started thinking about it, well, there are some things that at first, don't seem like they're related at all, but actually turn out to be very related. So open source. We have this in technology, obviously. We have this in food, too. The idea that, you can go to a potluck and contribute whatever you want and take from what other people bring. Or the idea that a recipe is available and something that you can actually, follow yourself and tweak and change. Of course, there's the closed source side of the world. McDonald's is not about to give out their recipe for their secret sauce. At the same time, I'm not really sure that at this point we'd want it. Design methodology. Well, there's waterfall, the prototypical standard old-fashioned way of designing software. We have this in food, too. Escoffier famously came up with this in the 1800s for the French cuisine. And in many modern environments in the food world, this is still how it's done. But not always. There are certain areas of cooking that are much more like agile development. You go to the market in the morning, you see what looks good, you pick up some ingredients that inspire you, you go home and you iterate on that. And if the language I'm using here sounds kind of like what maybe we do in software, it's because the process is actually the same. The actual content, okay, bits versus bytes, no pun intended, is different, but the actual process is the same. You pick up some ingredients, you do something with them, you evaluate it, and you see what you get, and you take notes and see how it works the next day. And maybe you tweak it and, iterate over it in different ways. Food also has APIs and libraries. If you think about flavors, you could think about a Mexican API, which really is, certain set of ingredients. You could think about Italian API, which, in fact, you could go so far as to make a chart of it and just say, right, for every kind of major flavor for different cultures, we have different ingredients that satisfy and give you an API for that particular cuisine. And some APIs are better than others. If you're trying to do Indian cuisine, you could grab curry powder, and that's, kind of gives you the essence of what a lot of Indian cuisine might be, but if you actually got 5 or 6 different spices and correctly blended them, you'd have an even better API to use there. So, is this clicker going to work? There we go. But what are APIs? What are libraries? What are these things? In the software world, they're contracts. There are contracts that say, hey, if you give me a certain set of data, I will do a certain set of operations on it and try to give it back to you. Now, maybe I'll throw an exception. Maybe I'll burn the dinner. Maybe it won't work. But that's kind of fundamentally what APIs are all about. But underneath them, they're really trying to model something. They're trying to model something on the way the world works. In software, one of our big jobs is to figure out what it is we're writing and do good architecture around that and think about what are the components of this system, what input should it be taking, and how should it actually produce an output. The same thing is true in the kitchen, but almost all of us really only step into the kitchen and just kind of execute a code in the sense that we follow a recipe. We very rarely actually stop and think, how do I write my own recipe? And so tonight what I want to share with you are a bunch of different kind of lower level models that you can use to go into the kitchen and start thinking about what's behind those APIs. So models govern our understanding of the way the world works. They give us predictions. This is actually a tree of a descendant of Newton's apple tree. Of course, Newton being famous for the analogy about gravity. And we have models about how gravity works. If I hold this and let go, it falls. That's gravity. And there's a model we have in our head. But where did that model come from? It starts out with Aristotle, way back in ancient times, and he basically said objects have a natural place they want to go to, which worked for the ancient Greeks, but not really very good model. You can't really do very good predictions with that, that's for sure. So we get Newton on the right, who formalized Galileo's work and basically said, right, here are some equations that actually describe how things fall, how gravity works. For the most part, that's a pretty good model with the equations he came up with. But they famously don't account for some very minor deviations in Mercury's orbit. For mine, this is the planet Earth. I couldn't find a nice image of Mercury going around the sun. But Mercury famously does not actually, you can't account for its orbit around the sun completely with the models that Newton came up with. Caramelization is a good guess, but it's actually not what happens at 155 Celsius. This is the temperature at which Maillard reactions begin to occur. So we start to see the outside of the cookie begin to turn light brown because that cookie is actually, the surface of the cookie is getting up to a temperature where that reaction can occur. A little bit hotter, around 180 degrees Celsius, and this is where you actually get your caramelization and the browning from that happening. And the other thing is, if you leave an oven even longer, then it will begin to turn even darker brown, and a lot of that just has to do with rate of reaction. So a simple browning model, hotter, more browning. I guess that's right, okay. So here's kind of a visual proof of this. I just baked up a batch of sugar cookies. This is going back to the, hey, let's gather some data and debug our sugar cookies. If you cook them at various times, you can actually begin to see that these reactions begin to pick up at pretty well-defined points, which is actually really cool to be able to go into your kitchen and visibly see something happen. So here's a better model for browning. There's two different main reactions that really involve that cookie turning brown, and not only are they just like instantaneous events, but they're time at temperature events, which is to say they have to get hot enough and then stay hot enough long enough to get pretty dark brown. So that's a better model. That's going from this idea that a cookie just magically goes from dough to cookie to understanding the temperatures that these things happen at now means that when you walk into the kitchen, you can think to yourself, hey, do I want whatever I'm baking to have this nice dark brown outside, at which point you know it has to get above those temperatures? Or you can ask yourself, hey, do I want to avoid these brown outside? And then you know you have to keep them below that temperature. And there are cases where you might want to do this because the browning also corresponds with a whole set of flavors and aromas, which are nutty, quite strong, delicious, but also sometimes mask more subtle flavors. So if you're cooking something that maybe is, sugar cookies actually are a good example where you don't want them to be too browned. You need to make sure you don't get them this hot. So hopefully this idea of models in the kitchen, you can begin to see where I'm going with this, in the sense that we now have a better model. Just like talking about gravity earlier on, we now have a better model about what's happening when you bake goods in your oven. So here's another one. What happens when you cook a piece of meat? Obviously, it's temperature related again. It gets hotter. The outside of this you actually can see is brown. So you know, because you're seeing that brown, that the outside of this got to at least 155 degrees Celsius. And you can see that in the middle there's actually kind of this bit where it's rare and it gets medium rare, and then the outside it's even more well done. This is what I call a gradient of doneness. So a simple recipe for cooking meat is basically follow a recipe, but we can do better than that. So this is kind of a standard chart you would see for a very simple rubric for how to cook your steak. Basically, if you want it done medium well, cook it for 4 minutes on each side. But why? What's it actually doing? It's not like there's a timer in that steak that says at 4 minutes it's suddenly going to turn medium well. That's because in the case of steak, just like I was saying about the cookies having certain temperatures where certain reactions occur, this is true in steak. There's a protein called myosin that begins to denature, and forgive me, I only know the number in Fahrenheit, around 122 Fahrenheit. Anybody? Actually, I'm kind of curious. In Germany, how well known is Fahrenheit for cooking? Do people not know Fahrenheit at all? Okay, so 122 Fahrenheit's probably around... No, it's colder than that. It's got to be colder than that. Isn't it? 122 Fahrenheit? 50 Celsius. Okay, I'll take the answer from the man who's got, a computer to tell him. So beginning around that temperature, 50 Celsius, this one protein begins to denature and cook. And what this means is that the actual protein molecule, which is folded up on itself and pretty compact, it actually loses that shape. And as part of losing that shape, as it gets hotter, the molecule actually snaps out of its native conformation, and it also changes texture. And in the case of something like myosin, this is a good thing. We actually happen to like that texture. But there's another protein called actin that begins to denature around 60 degrees Celsius. Maybe it's 65 degrees Celsius, around in that range. And that protein, when it denatures, happens to make the meat tough. So in addition to actin and myosin, which of course, I'm giving you a very simple, quick explanation on those two proteins. There's actually some more complexities in there. But basically hold in your head this idea that there are different temperature points that these reactions are occurring. There's another one for a protein called collagen. Now, collagen is an amazing molecule. It is the longest protein in the body. It is the toughest protein. It is stronger than steel, volume for volume, in terms of what it does. And in muscle tissue, it's basically like steel. It actually provides structural reinforcement. So if you think about animals like octopus or squid, these animals have no bones. What they have instead is cartilage, which is made up of collagen. So collagen is this really complicated molecule. It's really long, and it's what makes cooking a lot of meats very difficult and actually tough, quite literally tough. Instead of just going from a native state where it's raw to a denatured state where it's cooked, it actually goes through 3 states. It's native, in which case it's actually pretty tender. Then there's a middle point where it's denatured, and at that point it's rubbery. It's actually, a material scientist will describe it as a rubber. And then when you get to this third state, it's called hydrolyzed. What happens in this third state is that the collagen molecule itself is basically chopped up into just little free-floating pieces that have no structure left at all. So if you've ever had like calamari or squid at a restaurant and it's really chewy, has this happened to you? Yeah, that's because whoever cooked it got it to the denatured state, but not hydrolyzed and not native. So if you take squid and you deep fry it really fast and pull it out, it actually doesn't really denature that much, so it's still tender. Or if you put it into a slow cooker and you cook it for hours and hours, it'll actually denature and hydrolyze, at which point it'll also be tender. So if you're ever cooking a piece of meat and it comes out really tough, the question to ask yourself is, hey, is this piece of meat high in collagen? And did I cook it such that the protein is denatured but didn't hydrolyze? And if that's the case, then you know you actually have to cook it longer. Now, how do you know if a piece of meat has a lot of collagen in it? Here's another little quick side model. Collagen is like, as I said, it's like steel. It's structural support in the animal. So think about the part of the animal that has to do structural work. So in the animal of like a cow, it'll be the legs. And if you actually look at, ducks, think about, ducks walking around and swimming. Duck legs need a long time in cooking because those parts of the animal are really high in collagen because that part of the animal is actually doing more, has to bear more of the load of the weight. So there's a really easy model to know if, hey, do I need to cook this thing for a long time because it's high in collagen? So here's a quick recipe. I couldn't come and not give you one quick actual example of a recipe. You can get some beef short ribs. These guys are high in collagen. You can get a slow cooker and just a bottle of marinade. Toss the meat into the slow cooker, pour the sauce in, and wait 6 hours. If you wait 2 hours, it'll be tough. And it's really counterintuitive, because you'll be like, shoot, I screwed this up. But no, you didn't. You just have to let it cook long enough for that collagen protein to actually denature. So here's a more complicated model. I know I went on for a little while about meat proteins, but it actually turns out that once you understand there's 3 different proteins, you can then answer the question of how do I cook this piece of meat without having to follow a recipe, which is actually pretty cool. So if you think about turkeys are actually this conundrum in the US, and I don't know how often people eat them here, but in the US they're a big thing for Thanksgiving, and they're almost universally always not very good. And the reason for this is that parts of the turkey are low in collagen and parts are high in collagen. And if you've got one bird and you put it into an oven, it's really hard to get the oven to only heat half of the bird. And you can try all sorts of tricks. You can take ice packs and put them on top of the breast for half an hour beforehand to get that part of the meat colder. Or you can take tin foil and wrap up the breast again to try to reflect more of the heat so it doesn't heat up as much. Or you can just take the legs and cut them off and put them in your slow cooker overnight and then cook the breast like you normally would and then just put it back on the platter together and nobody will know. And it makes it a lot easier to make a good tasting turkey. The other thing that happens in the US with turkey is we're told cook it to 165 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 74 Celsius. Any guesses as to why we're told to do that? Huh? So in the US at least, I don't know about the turkey supply here, but in the US we have to contend with these guys. This is salmonella. Salmonella does not exactly make for a good dining experience. It also doesn't really make for, I'll leave it at that. So there's this simple model that says, hey, salmonella, it dies at some point. You get it hot enough and it dies, in which case it can't infect you. Okay, that's handy, that's good, that's a simple model. Cook meat to 70 plus degrees Celsius. The problem is, going back to those 3 proteins I mentioned a little while ago, actin and myosin and collagen, well, this means that all of those actin proteins and all the myosin proteins are sure as heck going to be cooked, which means, I should actually say the actin proteins are going to be cooked, which means the meat's going to be tough. So what's really going on here? Why did they say 70 degrees Celsius? There's this thing called the danger zone. And it's not 5 minutes before a demo while your software is not compiling. That's its own danger zone. The danger zone in food basically says you're not supposed to hold food between these 2 temperatures. It's like 3.5 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees Celsius for more than 2 to 4 hours. The idea is that it's actually not that salmonella, by just like one single salmonella bacteria will kill you. It's that a whole bunch of them will. It's a probability thing. And so you might have a piece of turkey that has, a few actual, individual instances of the bacterium. The probability of that hurting you, not that high. But if you were to basically incubate the salmonella on that turkey for a long time, more than 2 to 4 hours, then the quantity present might actually begin to cause you problems. So there's this idea that actually when it comes to food safety, it's either safe or it's not. It's really like how safe is it or how much risk is there. And the idea of the danger zone rule is to keep down the probability so that it's not very likely to cause you problems. But the reality is that it's not like at 3 degrees Celsius, right, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not like the bacteria are not multiplying at all, and at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, like it's party for them or something. It's this dotted line, this curve, this, how quickly they multiply. So they say 140 degrees, and it's actually, you'll notice it's past the edge of that curve by a few degrees, because it's basically, it's a way of making sure that, you're not going to basically create a perfect petri dish for something that's going to make for a bad evening. The thing is, the temperature at which these different organisms die and how long you hold them for, it's a little more complicated than just get it hot enough and it dies. It's this probability thing. So this is actually from the USDA. It's the United States Division of Agriculture, and the FSIS is the Food Safety Inspectional Services. The EU code is, I believe, based off of the same code that we use in the US for a lot of the food safety stuff. They actually publish tables of time by temperature that say, hey, you can cook your chicken or your turkey at 140 degrees. You just have to hold it at the temperature long enough to properly pasteurize it. So this is actually kind of cool because it means now you can make sure your food is safe and at the same time not inadvertently cook all of those proteins that make the meat tough. So the better food safety model, cook your food hot enough to properly pasteurize it, but not so hot that you end up actually turning it into a piece of rubber. How about eggs? Same thing here. The simple model for eggs basically says, throw it in some boiling water, hold it for 7 to 9 minutes. This will give you an okay egg. Here's some data because, it's much more fun if you actually see what it looks like. This is what an egg looks like if you cook it for 2 minutes. If you like raw eggs, it's fine, but it's pretty gross. 3 minutes, 4. You see where this is going, right? Around 7 minutes or so, the yolk begins, the white's basically set at this point, and the yolk's still completely running. Around 8 minutes, most of the yolk is beginning to set up and part of it's still running. 9 minutes if you happen to like your eggs, on the pretty set side. And by 10 minutes, the entire yolk is actually completely set up. In 11 minutes, you basically have kind of a nice hard-boiled egg. But if you're going for a really nice soft poached egg like that photograph I showed you a few minutes ago, how do you actually do this? Well, what's going on here is, we take an egg, we take it out of the fridge at a cold temperature, at least in the U.S. I guess you guys, do Germans actually store their eggs in the fridge? Yes? Okay, because I know in some countries, like down in Italy, or in Switzerland, the eggs are just out on the shelf in the grocery store, which is kind of, as an American, it's like, wow, this is weird. So in the case of an egg, at least in the U.S., you take it out of the fridge at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, you drop it into a pot of boiling water, and it's going to do this. It's going to get hotter and hotter. And we try to take it out, maybe 5 to 7 minutes in. It'll be a little bit of carryover, and then it'll begin to get colder. But what we really want is an egg where we get this, the 62 degrees Celsius point, the point at which some of the proteins in the egg begin to denature, but below 70 degrees Celsius, the point at which a lot of the other proteins begin to denature. We want to hit this really, really narrow band, this ideal band. And if we can do something like this, where we throw it into some particular environment that's at the ideal temperature, we can actually control it much, much better than we can with time. Because fundamentally, all the reactions I'm telling you about are temperature dependent. They're also time dependent, but temperature is much, much more important. So the better egg model is, hey, cook your egg for, just get it to that temperature, and then, the proteins you want to denature will, and you don't have to really worry about overcooking it. So who here has heard of something called sous vide? Yes? No? Who here has actually heard of sous vide as a cooking technique? Okay, so sous vide is it's a French term for under vacuum. It kind of doesn't make sense in the context of cooking, but in the case of something like meats and proteins, the concept basically is, hey, if you take your meats or your eggs and you put them into an environment that's at a particular temperature, you can control exactly what reactions happen. So the name comes from under vacuum because if you're doing things like chicken or steak, you put it into a vacuum seal bag and you draw a seal on it to remove all the air out of the bag. And then you put that vacuum sealed bag into a water bath that's set to the target temperature. So the idea here is if your water bath is at 65 degrees Celsius and you put an egg into that water bath, then that egg is going to come up to 65 degrees Celsius. All the reactions that occur below 65 Celsius will happen, and everything that has to be hotter than that will never happen. So you can actually cook fantastic eggs this way. You basically drop an egg in, you wait maybe half hour to 45 minutes, maybe an hour, to make sure it comes up to temperature and has enough time to actually kind of come to equilibrium. But beyond that, you can just leave it in the water bath for a day, and it's still perfectly cooked. It sounds crazy, but it's hot enough to avoid any food safety issues, and it's cold enough to avoid it from overcooking. And so if I was going to cook all of you brunch, like all of however many hundred of people in here, there's no way I could do it with a pot of water in a traditional way. But now that I have this better model, now that I understand that these reactions are occurring at certain temperatures, you can start coming up with new techniques. So this actually was first originally done in the 1960s, is the first time it was commercialized, actually by a hotel in New Jersey, where some cook there wanted to figure out how to more precisely control exactly what was happening and not worry about serving a large number of people and still making it safe. It turns out you can actually make some really, really good food this way. And if you go to really high-end restaurants, Michelin-starred restaurants, they cook most of their proteins this way at this point because they can dial in exactly the temperature that the food's going to cook to. And they can control it and never overcook it, which is fantastic. So there are commercial units that do this that are actually available in the consumer market. This is actually a piece of lab gear that you would see in a chemistry lab. This is what I use at home. I got mine off of eBay. Immersion recirculator will do it for you. The problem with them is they're kind of expensive and you never know exactly what they were used for in the chem lab, so you never know what's going to end up in your food. I hope I don't die of some strange exotic disease, although it'd be kind of cool. There are consumer model units that are actually made to go in your home. There's something called a Sous Vide Supreme, which is, it's probably about €300, which, we can do better than that if you've got a pair of wire cutters. Just take anything that holds a body of liquid at a certain temperature, interpose in the power supply, and set whatever it is you have as your heat source, just turn it to the on position and basically interpose your own power supply. It's just like a debugger attaching to code executing. It's exactly the same concept. You're either flipping the power on or off, interposing that variable to actually control what happens. So you can do this for like probably 25 euro in terms of parts and get something that's just as good as what you would do at home. The piece of meat on the right is what you get when you cook this way. Notice that the whole thing, center to edge, is medium rare. Also notice that the outside's kind of gray and not very appealing looking. And that's because the food hasn't reached a temperature hot enough to produce those Maillard reactions I was talking about earlier. I mean, again, the Maillard reaction's not going to happen until 155 degrees Celsius. If they put this into a water bath around 60 degrees or 55 degrees Celsius, you're 100 degrees off. So in this case, what you do is you take the meat out and then you drop it into a really hot pan just to sear the outside. So you're basically taking the two variables, the internal temperature and the external temperature, and you're making them orthogonal and splitting them and cooking for one variable and then cooking for the second variable, which is actually it makes so much sense when you think about it this way. It's much, much easier than trying to cook a piece of steak where you're trying to steer both of these variables at the same time, because in variable you either burn the outside or you overcook the inside. And going back to the burnt baked good pan earlier, you get the same problem. So in this case, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's a lot of fun to play with. So here's another model. Who here likes to bake? Yeah, like one hand or three hands go up. Who here likes to cook, steak and stuff? Wow, who here cooks at all? Nobody raises their hand. So gluten is one of the key variables in baking. Normally, we control how much gluten we want by changing the kind of flour. Different kinds of grains have different levels of gluten. Gluten's it's a combination of two different proteins that actually give structure to bread. So if you think about French bread that has a lot of gluten, if you think about a stretchy kind of membrane-like property of the inside of French bread, that means it's high in gluten. And if you think about something that's really crumbly, like a cake, where it just kind of falls apart, that's very low in gluten. So here's kind of a quick chart. Yeast breads, croissants, rolls, those are high in gluten. Besides just controlling the gluten level, you can also do other things like add oil to the batter or add sugar, and these things actually interfere with the ability of the monomers and polymers from actually forming a bond. They get in the way of that chemical bond. So you can try testing stuff, and you can go and make a batch of cookies two different ways. In this case, I made 4 different batches of cookies, varying the gluten level and varying things like the fat level, trying to get a sense of how much does this make a difference. So we're all familiar with A/B testing in software, yeah? The idea that you're going to develop a system and show it to users in one of 2 different ways, and you're going to see which one performs better or responds better. The same thing is done in food. In food, it's called a triangle test, because if you give somebody an A sample and a B sample and say, how is it different? There's just too much subjectivity in there. It's really, really difficult for someone given 2 things to tell you how they're different. So it turns out to be much, much better to give somebody 3 samples, 2 of which are the same and 1 which is different, and say, which one's different? Because then you can start doing the odds and the stats on it. If I give you 2 cookies and say they're different, which one's different? Well, they're both different. But if I give you 3 cookies and say which of these three, which is not like the others, then you can begin actually counting. So when I did this, I was controlling for 2 different variables. In one case, people thought, sample A, how to put it? If you've got A is different than B and C and people are randomly picking, then they're going to get A 33% of the time, which is to say, in this case, where you've got 1/3 versus 2/3, people can't tell a difference, which means that variable doesn't impact the actual outcome. Whereas on the other side, it was a 6 versus 7 count, which means that actually people were noticing a difference in whatever I was doing in that particular batch. So this idea of testing being done in food is done in the commercial food world. It's called sensory analysis, and it's actually totally amazing and fascinating. So it does, it fascinates me. So the better gluten model basically says, hey, you can control for things by changing the gluten level or changing the fat or changing the amount of water, the amount of agitation time. if you're into baking, this is really handy to know. So here's a quick chart of most of the temperatures that I've thrown at you so far. This hopefully kind of begins to put things into perspective in the sense that most of the temperatures we deal with are actually in a pretty narrow range. And so if you go into your kitchen and you find you're constantly burning things, or you're finding that things are constantly undercooked, this is a pretty good indicator that there's something that's out of calibration in your kitchen. Maybe your oven's too hot or too cold, or maybe the way you're handling the ingredients and the amount of time that you're cooking them for is too short or too long. Definitely, again, a lot of analogies to kind of the computer world in the sense that controlling what you know is actually really, really important. And if you don't have good data coming in, you're going to get bad, data going out. So a simple reaction model basically goes back to that last chart and says, hey, get things hot or cold enough to cause the reaction. But there's an even better model. What happens if we go really, really hot? 800 Fahrenheit, I think, is around 450 Celsius. You can do this in your kitchen. It's a lot of fun. That's my oven at home. I clipped the lock off of the safety latch so I can open the door when it's on cleaning cycle mode. Let's just say you can cook a really good pizza in about 45 seconds. The problem with it is that ovens are not designed to be this hot. So let's see, I think the piece of glass on the left is the surviving piece of glass from my oven. There was a day when I was making one of these pizzas, and I was putting it into the oven, and you can almost imagine the Mission Impossible slow motion shot of the drop of the pizza sauce coming off the edge of the pizza and falling and hitting the glass that's at 850 degrees. And the glass just goes. There's a reason that your oven has a safety latch on it, and it's because the glass is not designed to go through thermal shock. So the piece of, quartz on the right is what I replaced the broken piece of glass with. It's heat rated to, I think, about 1,350 degrees. It's what they used to put on missile nose cones. It's truly amazing what you can buy on the internet these days. And it works great. It's also cheaper than the replacement part from the oven manufacturer, which I kind of don't get. I think it costs like $60 for a replacement sheet of, amazing. So you can do fun things on the other side. As was, I think I caught in the introduction, even though I don't speak German, I heard my name and sang about ice cream and sang about 30 seconds. You indeed can make ice cream in as little as 30 seconds. It works really, really well. And in the case of ice cream, the thing about ice cream in terms of looking at the model of it is that it's about the texture. And the texture is about the size of the ice crystal. And the size of the ice crystal is related to how long it takes the water to freeze. So traditionally, the way you make really nice, smooth, creamy ice cream is you put enough sugar and enough fat into the base so that the ice crystals aren't able to aggregate together. And you turn it constantly kind of as extra insurance. But you can also just freeze it really, 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 really quickly. And the ice crystals won't have time to aggregate. And it's also delicious. The other fun thing about it is that ethanol does not normally freeze. But at negative 196 C, it does freeze quite nicely. So you can actually make really nice alcoholic ice creams, enough where one scoop will give you a hangover. Unfortunately, on the other side, you can also make ice cream so cold that it actually does bodily damage. I have frozen one TV producer's tongue accidentally. Shh. So better reaction model is to understand that all of these things are time at temperature dependent. And if you take the time variable way out of bound, either to the extreme cold or the extreme hot, it may work in some cases. It may not work in other cases. So pizza happens to work great because it's so thin that there's no difference between the middle and the outside when you make thin crust pizza. There's no difference between the middle and the outside coming to temperature. The whole thing just kind of goes whoop and comes to temperature. If you're trying to make, bread, I guarantee you at that temperature, the outside is going to be a piece of carbon, while the middle is still a completely wet dough. But the idea that, the rate of reaction and the change in temperature ticks up, as a delta in the temperature, pretty useful to keep in mind. So simple models, simple predictions, better models. Hopefully now I've given you a ton of, I've thrown a lot at you in terms of better food models. But hopefully next time you walk into the kitchen, you're going to think, oh, okay, right. That guy from the US said, make sure that you denature your collagen. I've got to cook it long enough. Or, maybe this piece of meat's really low in collagen. Maybe it's something like salmon, where, you want to make sure you don't overcook it, otherwise it becomes really dry. Or maybe it's things like the eggs, where you understand the temperatures and you know that if you get it too hot, it'll become a hard-boiled egg. But if you can hold it at that magic 62 degrees Celsius, it'll cook just perfect. Temperature is probably the most important thing in cooking. I would say in software, the most important thing is probably really good analytics and debugging information about what's coming out of your system, because you can't debug without good data. In the case of food, temperature is probably the most important variable. So if you're trying to figure out why something's not working in the kitchen, get a probe thermometer, get an infrared thermometer. These are two different devices. A probe thermometer tells you the internal temperature. Get a probe thermometer that's got a long lead on it, so you can put it in your oven and leave the, the unit on the outside. I've deep fried more than one thermometer. Let me tell you, it does not end well. And then the other thing to get is an infrared thermometer. This tells you the surface temperature of things. You basically can just kind of point at something and click the little trigger, and it'll tell you how hot it is. And it's great for telling if your pans, are a certain temperature, or if you're trying to figure out, you can actually take a loaf of bread, and if you're starting to bake it, or if you just take a piece of toast and you toast it, right at the point where it begins to turn brown, your infrared thermometer will tell you the surface temperature, and it will line up with that 155 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's really rewarding to have a model about how something works and have a theory, and then to go and see some data and to see the real world actually line up with that. So there's these two quotes that I'll close with that I kind of truly love. My work here is done. Yay. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. The reason for this is that models are only so good. They never describe the world perfectly. There's always a delta between your model and how the world actually works. The better the model, the smaller that delta, but there's always room for error in there. I don't know if you guys read Hacker News and Y Combinator, but every so often there's a story that comes up about this math department in Chicago that couldn't send email for more than 500 miles. They could send email to anybody they wanted within a 500-mile radius. And they went to their IT guy and said, "We're having problems. We can't send long-distance email." And, the IT guys kind of go, crusty old math professors, they don't know anything. But these are math guys. They're into data. They had actually generated a plot, a map, where they had plotted every point where they could send email, and there was a very nice fit where it was 500 miles. Technology is not supposed to work this way, but, these IT guys are looking at, what happens? They spent a little while debugging it, and it turns out that somebody had recently upgraded a router in their infrastructure, and it had gone from one version of Cisco's OS, iOS, not to confuse it with Apple, to the next version. And there was some default setting having to do with the time to live on packets. It had gotten set to 0 milliseconds. And it turns out that 1 millisecond is 500 miles. So email could get out 0 milliseconds, but no further than that. So keep that in mind next time you're looking at something and it doesn't work that way. Yeah, in theory it doesn't. But in practice, sometimes you really can only send email for 500 miles. The other good quote is, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. You won't be able to figure out why your email can't go past 500 miles until you come up with a model and a theory that might plausibly fit it, even if it's not a very good one. it'll probably at least be useful in trying to figure out what's going on. All of this stuff is true in the kitchen. All of it's true in computer science. All of it's true in pretty much any field I've ever come across. You've got models about the way things work, and when you start thinking about APIs and libraries, those are basically just promises about how stuff's supposed to work. They're models, they're contracts. At the end of the day, hopefully they work out for you. Hopefully you go into your kitchen and you can turn out a great dinner. Hopefully your project compiles in time 5 minutes before your demo, and you pull off a victory. But without having some sense of how the stuff works underneath, you can't go into the kitchen, you can't go in front of the computer and actually write anything that works. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. My contact info is up there as well, so if you don't feel like asking me a question here, please email me. I'm always happy to answer. And thank you so much for your time. So if you have a question, we don't have a mic to pass around, so just either stand up or raise your hand and I'll acknowledge whoever wants to heckle me with a question. Oh, come on, you're all too polite. Somebody's got to have a question. Do you guys know Ferris Bueller's Day Off? The line Bueller? Bueller? No, okay. Well, if no one wants to pester me with a question, I'm happy to stay up here afterward and answer questions individually. Oh, wait. Okay. Well, I see a question there. How often a what?
How often a week do you actually eat? Because it looks like that you just spend so much time cooking.
For the last 2 weeks, I have been traveling, actually. I don't know what it is about production systems that know when you go on vacation. I eat just like the rest of us, 3 times a day, maybe a snack or two somewhere in the middle. I cook most of my own meals. I will say, having been involved in the food science side of things, I do eat differently when I go out than I used to eat. Now when I go out, I look at something that's on the menu and I think to myself, if it's a good restaurant, I think to myself, what looks really disgusting on this menu? And I get that. Because if it's a good restaurant, it's probably not disgusting. It's probably just the description, which means there's probably some idea that it's actually really good. The other thing I like to do is actually just go and find kind of what's local and interesting. So when I was in Italy, I think the best meal I had was a €3 sandwich at a farmer's market where it was the stall that was set up selling food for people that were buying ingredients who cooked locally.